For years, a billionaire businessman lived in a massive, silent mansion with his young son, who had grown up without his mother and barely spoke a word. Every single day, without fail, the boy would walk to the same spot in the house and quietly point at a picture frame hanging on the wall. No one knew why. The father, always busy and emotionally distant, never paid much attention to the habit. The house staff had seen it countless times, but no one questioned it until a new maid was hired. She watched the boy closely, noticed the pattern, and decided to follow her instincts. What she found changed everything the family thought they knew about their past, and uncovered something that had been hidden in plain sight for years. The answer was never in the boy's words. It was always in where he pointed. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Richard Collins, a very rich businessman, lived in a huge mansion with his 8-year-old son, Ethan. The mansion was quiet, cold, and full of memories of Laura, Richard's wife, who had died 8 years earlier while giving birth to Ethan. Since that day, things had changed. The house, once full of life, now felt empty. Richard had thrown himself into work, spending most of his time in meetings, traveling, and growing his business. He barely stayed home, and when he did, he avoided anything that reminded him of Laura. He especially avoided looking at the large painting in the main room. Ethan, on the other hand, spent hours in front of that painting. He didn't talk much. In fact, he had trouble speaking and usually just pointed at things. He would sit quietly, drawing with crayons and glancing up at the painting now and then. The house staff still worked there, the same people who had known Laura, but they kept their distance from Richard and Ethan. Everything felt stuck in time. Ethan was a quiet boy who didn't make friends easily. He didn't play like other kids and didn't enjoy going outside. His days were spent mostly inside the house, moving from one room to another or sitting on the floor with his drawings. He always carried around a small notebook where he drew strange pictures, shapes, faces, and sometimes things that looked like parts of the mansion. But no matter what he drew, he always returned to the old painting in the main room. It showed a peaceful garden, but Ethan would point to a small shadow near the edge of the frame, as if trying to tell someone something. No one really paid attention. The maids would sometimes glance at him, confused, but they didn't say anything. Richard barely noticed. He walked past his son with a distracted nod, always looking at his phone or talking to someone on a call. He didn't ask about the drawings, and he never looked at the painting. Ethan was alone, even when he wasn't. The mansion itself was enormous, filled with rooms no one used anymore. The walls were covered with expensive decorations and furniture that hadn't been touched in years. Laura's old piano still stood in the music room, untouched. Her books were still on the shelves in the library, collecting dust. In the main dining hall, a long table remained set for more people than ever sat there. It was as if the house had frozen the day Laura died. Richard had never wanted to change anything. To him, updating the house felt like letting go, and he wasn't ready for that. But keeping everything the same didn't bring peace either. It just made the silence louder. At night, Richard would sometimes stop in the hallway and stare at the closed door to Laura's old room, then turn away and go back to work in his office. He avoided feelings and memories, and in doing so, he also avoided his son. The staff, who had worked for the family for years, noticed how different things had become. They remembered when Laura was alive, how laughter used to echo through the hallways, and how Richard would smile more. Now, they rarely saw him unless he needed something. They cleaned, cooked, and kept the mansion running, but they didn't speak much. They kept their distance from Richard out of respect and caution. With Ethan, they were more gentle, offering him snacks or leaving out crayons and paper. But he rarely reacted. His world was small and quiet. He trusted no one, except maybe the painting. Sometimes the butler, Mr. Harris, would pause when walking past the main room and see Ethan pointing at the shadow on the canvas. He didn't understand what the boy saw, but the look in Ethan's eyes made him pause. Something about it felt unusual, like Ethan was watching something no one else could see. Richard's schedule was always full. He had video meetings in the morning, calls in the afternoon, and dinners with investors at night. He didn't notice the small changes happening around the house. He didn't see how Ethan's drawings started to include the same dark figure over and over again, a figure hidden in the corners of the rooms or behind doors. He didn't notice the way Ethan would sometimes stop walking and stand completely still, staring at nothing. Richard's mind was always on his company, on deals, on deadlines. When Ethan tried once to show him one of the drawings, Richard only gave a brief glance and told him to go play somewhere else. The silence between them was deep, not just the kind made by lack of words, but the kind made by distance, confusion, and hurt. Richard didn't know how to be a father. He had never tried to learn. He told himself he was doing his best by providing everything Ethan needed. But what Ethan needed most was someone to listen. And so, life continued inside that large, lonely house. Every day followed the same pattern. Richard worked. Ethan drew. The staff moved quietly through the halls. The rooms stayed cold. The painting stayed on the wall. And Ethan kept pointing to it every single day. His small hand would rise, and he would fix his eyes on the shadow in the frame, as if it were alive, as if it had something to say. No one asked what he saw. No one listened. The mansion was filled with silence, not just because it was quiet, but because the people inside it no longer spoke about what mattered. Laura was gone. Richard couldn't face it. Ethan couldn't say it. And the house held on to their grief like a secret. The days stretched on, slow and heavy, trapped in the past. Nothing moved forward, nothing changed. The house, the father, the child, all waiting for something. But no one knew what. Only the painting, and perhaps Ethan, held the answer. Grace Miller arrived at the mansion on a cloudy morning. She was the new housekeeper, recently hired after many others had come and gone without lasting long. The house was quiet when she stepped out of the taxi, holding her single suitcase. A member of the staff led her inside without much conversation. The first thing Grace noticed was how big and cold the place felt. The rooms were clean but lifeless, like no one really lived there. Richard Collins, the man who owned the house, greeted her quickly and formally. He didn't ask questions or give much information, just told her where she would be staying and what her tasks would be. He said she should speak with the head of staff for more details. Grace nodded, trying to remain professional, but she already sensed something strange in the atmosphere. A quiet tension filled the air. As she looked around, she noticed a small boy standing far down the hallway. He didn't say anything. He just stared at her, then disappeared behind a door. Over the first few days, Grace focused on her work. She moved through the mansion, cleaning rooms, dusting furniture, and organizing old items. She noticed that many of the portraits and pictures hadn't been touched in years. Some had layers of dust, others were slightly crooked on the walls. She tried not to move things too much, just enough to clean and make the place feel less abandoned. No one said much to her besides giving basic instructions. Most of the staff were quiet, doing their tasks and then disappearing. Grace kept to herself, but she couldn't stop thinking about the boy she had seen. She hadn't seen him up close since that first day. He never spoke to her, but she could sometimes feel his eyes on her. One afternoon, while organizing picture frames in the main hallway, she saw him again. He was standing in front of a golden frame, touching it with his fingertips and staring at it like it was important. He didn't say anything, and when she took a step toward him, he quietly walked away. Grace grew more curious about the boy. She learned from another maid that his name was Ethan and that he was Mr. Collins's son. The maid also told her that Ethan didn't talk much and usually stayed by himself. Grace tried not to ask too many questions, but she started paying more attention. Every day, Ethan would go to the same picture frame with the golden border. He would stand very still in front of it, touch it gently, and stare at it for a long time. Grace began to time her cleaning so she could pass by that hallway at the same moment. She didn't want to bother him. She just wanted to understand what was going on. The picture in the frame seemed ordinary at first glance. It showed a garden scene, but there was something strange about how focused Ethan was on it. It was like he saw something inside it that no one else could see. Grace couldn't explain it, but the way he acted made her feel uneasy. Despite her growing concern, Grace didn't share her thoughts with anyone at first. She wanted to stay professional and not cause problems. Still, the boy's behavior stayed on her mind. One morning, she decided to get a closer look at the picture Ethan kept visiting. She waited until the hallway was empty, then slowly approached the frame. It looked normal. Nothing hidden, no writing, no buttons. Just a painting of a garden with a few trees and shadows. She stared at it for a while, but didn't feel what Ethan seemed to feel. The moment she stepped away, she turned and saw him at the end of the hallway again, watching her. He didn't say a word, just stood there. Later that day, she asked Mr. Collins casually about the painting. His response was quick and cold. He told her to focus on her job and not to get involved with Ethan's habits. He said the boy liked to imagine things and that it wasn't Grace's concern. Then he went back to his office without looking at her. Grace felt uncomfortable with the way Richard dismissed her concern. She didn't mean to overstep, but something wasn't right. She had worked in many homes before, but none of them felt like this. The people were distant, the air felt heavy, and even the silence felt different. She continued doing her job, but she couldn't ignore Ethan's actions. Every day it was the same. The boy went to the frame, touched it, and stared at it. No one else in the house reacted or even looked twice. Grace found that strange. It was as if they were used to it, or had decided long ago not to question anything. She started leaving small signs of kindness for Ethan, like organizing his crayons or placing a clean piece of paper near where he liked to draw. He didn't say thank you or even make eye contact, but he began to stop and look at the items for longer. Grace didn't expect anything more. She just wanted him to feel that someone noticed him. Even though Richard had told her not to get involved, Grace couldn't help but care. Ethan seemed lonely in a way that was hard to describe. He wasn't just quiet, he was disconnected, like he didn't know how to reach out or trust anyone. Grace remembered how, on her first day, he had disappeared behind a door as soon as he saw her. Now, after a few days, he didn't hide anymore. He still didn't talk, but he watched her more openly. Grace felt that was a small step. She didn't ask questions or try to force a conversation. She just kept doing her work, passing by him without pressure, leaving space for him to feel safe. She didn't know what had happened to make the house so tense, or why Ethan acted the way he did. But something in her told her to stay patient. And every day, like clockwork, Ethan returned to the same golden frame, touched it with his small fingers, and stared at it, while everyone else in the house continued to ignore it. Grace had been working at the mansion for a few weeks, and little by little, she began to create a quiet connection with Ethan. She didn't push him or force conversation. Instead, she used small gestures to get closer. She started by leaving simple toys near where he liked to sit. She noticed he liked soft textures and calming colors, so she found a few plush animals and building blocks and placed them carefully in spots where he might notice them. Ethan didn't say anything, but he began picking them up, holding them, and sometimes even carrying them around. Grace also began reading out loud when she was nearby, choosing simple stories and sitting close enough for him to hear, but not so close as to make him uncomfortable. Ethan never answered her directly, but once in a while he would sit nearby while she read. Grace didn't comment. She just continued reading calmly. Over time, he seemed less distant. He would sometimes look up at her when she entered a room, and that alone felt like progress. One afternoon, while Grace was cleaning the main living room, something unusual happened. Ethan had been sitting near the painting again, as usual. He was staring at it, his fingers resting lightly on the bottom edge of the golden frame. Grace was dusting the nearby furniture when Ethan suddenly stood up and walked over to her. She paused what she was doing, surprised. He gently took her hand and led her back toward the painting. His grip was soft but firm, like he really needed her to follow him. When they reached the frame, he looked up at her, pointed at the painting, and said one word: "Mommy." His voice was quiet and a bit unclear, but Grace heard it. She crouched down to his level and asked softly, "Is your mommy there?" Ethan nodded, still pointing. He didn't say anything else, just kept his eyes on the picture. Grace didn't know what to say. She had no idea what he meant, but the way he said it and the way he looked at the painting made her feel that this moment was important. Ethan let go of her hand and stepped back. Later that day, during dinner, Grace sat at the far end of the table while Richard, as usual, sat reading something on his phone and eating quickly. After a few minutes, she decided to speak. "Ethan said something earlier today," she began. Richard didn't look up. She continued. He pointed at the painting in the living room and said, "Mommy." As soon as the words left her mouth, Richard's mood changed. He stopped eating, set down his fork, and stared at her with a cold expression. "I asked you not to bring up strange things," he said firmly. "Don't encourage him. He doesn't know what he's saying. Just let him be and do your job." His tone was sharp and final. Grace didn't argue. She nodded and returned to her meal, but her mind was racing. Why would Ethan say that? And why would Richard react so strongly? Something didn't feel right, and Grace couldn't ignore her growing curiosity. She knew she had to look more closely at that painting. That evening, after dinner, when the house was quiet, Grace returned to the living room. The lights were dim, and the hallway was empty. She stood in front of the golden-framed painting that Ethan had pointed to so many times. For a while, she just looked at it. The garden in the image seemed calm, with nothing unusual at first glance. But now that she was really studying it, she noticed small things. The frame itself had a few scratches that looked older than the rest of the furniture. The wall behind it had small cracks, like the surface had shifted over time. More than that, there was something odd about the shape of the frame. It wasn't perfectly even. One corner seemed slightly thicker than the others. Grace reached out and touched the edge. It didn't feel loose, but there was a faint difference in texture where the frame met the wall. She didn't know much about construction, but it seemed strange. She leaned in, looking at the corners and the sides, wondering if there was something hidden behind it. That night, after finally going to bed, Grace had trouble sleeping. Her thoughts kept going back to Ethan's voice and that one word, "Mommy." She tried to tell herself it was just a child's imagination, but something about his eyes, the way he said it, made her feel otherwise. Eventually, she fell asleep, but her rest didn't last long. In the middle of the night, she had a strange and intense dream. She was in the living room again, but it was darker. Everything felt heavier. In the dream, she stood in front of the golden frame and she could hear the sound of someone crying. The crying wasn't loud, but it was full of pain. It sounded like a woman. Grace looked around, but no one was there. Still, the crying continued, echoing quietly through the room. She turned toward the painting and saw that the frame was open, like it was a door. Then, just as she was about to step forward in the dream, she woke up suddenly. Her heart was racing and her hands were cold. When she opened her eyes, Grace looked around her dark room, trying to calm herself. She sat up in bed and breathed slowly, trying to shake off the dream. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was more than just a bad dream. It felt like her mind was trying to tell her something. She got out of bed and stood by the window, looking out at the garden below. Everything was quiet, but inside her, there was a strange tension. She thought about Ethan again, about how serious he had looked and how sure he had seemed. She thought about the strange details in the painting, the cracks in the wall, and Richard's reaction at dinner. Grace didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that, but she did believe in signs, and everything inside her was telling her that something was hidden behind that frame. She didn't know what it was or what it meant, but she was sure of one thing: she couldn't ignore it anymore. Something about that painting was not right. While Grace was cleaning the office, she moved some boxes that had been sitting untouched in the corner for a long time. The room was full of dust, and the furniture was covered with papers, old books and files. Most of it looked like business documents, contracts, financial reports, and letters related to Richard's company. She carefully wiped down the shelves and began organizing the boxes one by one. Inside one of the boxes, she found a stack of photo albums, family letters, and official papers with the Collins family name. It didn't seem like anyone had looked at these things in years. Curious but careful, she flipped through the items. She saw pictures of Laura smiling, pregnant, and holding a baby. Then came the newspaper clippings. One headline announced Ethan's birth. Another reported Laura's tragic death during childbirth. Grace paused, reading the article closely. But what shocked her the most was a photo inside a yellowed envelope at the bottom of the box. It showed Laura looking older, but alive. And the date on the back said it was taken just 2 years ago. Grace sat in the office for a moment, holding the photo and trying to understand what she had just seen. It didn't make sense. Everything in the house, every conversation, every quiet moment spoke of Laura's death. The staff avoided her name. Richard never mentioned her. Ethan only pointed at the painting, but the photo in her hands showed Laura clearly, alive, older, and standing in what looked like a city street. Grace flipped the picture over again. The date was written in pen. It wasn't a copy or something printed by mistake. It was real. She carefully tucked the photo into her pocket and closed the box, returning everything exactly how she had found it. She didn't want anyone to know she had seen it. That evening at dinner, Grace tried to act normal. Richard sat across the table, reading something on his tablet. Ethan was quiet, eating slowly. Grace looked at Richard more closely now. His face was cold, serious, and tired. She wondered what secrets he was keeping and why this photo existed. As the meal went on, Grace glanced over at Ethan. As usual, he was focused on something beyond the table. When he finished eating, he walked out of the dining room and headed straight for the hallway. Grace followed slowly behind, stopping just before the entrance. She peeked around the corner and saw Ethan standing in front of the golden-framed painting. He raised his hand again and pointed at it, just like he always did. Grace stared at him, wondering what he really saw when he looked at that picture. It wasn't just habit. There was meaning behind his action. It was too consistent to ignore. With everything she had found in the office, she now questioned everything. What if Laura hadn't died? What if she had been hidden or kept away for some reason? Was Ethan trying to tell someone this whole time? Grace felt a chill as the pieces started to connect. The boy, the painting, the photo, it all meant something. But no one wanted to talk about it. Everyone seemed afraid. The next morning, Grace felt the need to speak to someone, anyone, about what she had found. She waited until the staff had spread out through the house and went to find one of the gardeners outside. He was trimming the bushes near the edge of the property. Grace walked over and greeted him politely. After some small talk, she asked if he had ever noticed anything strange about the painting in the main hallway. The gardener looked at her, his face suddenly tense. He paused for a second, then said quietly, "The last person who asked about that painting doesn't work here anymore." Grace didn't know what to say. She asked who it was, but he didn't answer. Instead, he returned to his work, keeping his head down. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. She thanked him and walked back into the house. Her thoughts were spinning. The gardener's words weren't just a warning, they were a clear message. Someone in this house didn't want questions, and now she had one too many. For the rest of the day, Grace felt a strange pressure in her chest. Every time she passed Richard in the hallway, she wondered if he knew what she had found. She avoided speaking to him directly and tried to act like nothing had changed. But inside, she was watching everything more closely than ever. She noticed how Richard rarely made eye contact with Ethan. She noticed how the staff avoided being in the main hallway for too long. And she noticed how Ethan's behavior never changed. He kept going to that painting as if it held something important. Grace kept the photo hidden in her room, unsure what to do with it. If she showed it to Richard, he would probably get angry or worse. If she told the staff, they might report her. So she said nothing. But she didn't stop thinking. There were too many questions and no answers. If Laura was alive, where was she? And why was everyone pretending she wasn't? Grace felt fear, but also determination. Even though she was scared, Grace knew she couldn't turn away now. She had already seen too much. Something inside her told her to keep going, even if it was dangerous. She began to write things down, small details, things Ethan did, things Richard said, and what she had found in the boxes. She didn't know who she could trust, so she trusted no one. She just continued to do her job during the day and think deeply at night. Sometimes she would hear soft noises near the painting, like a creak or a tap, but no one else seemed to notice. She kept watching Ethan, wondering what more he might reveal. She no longer believed this was all in his imagination. There was something behind that painting, something connected to Laura, and she was sure of it. Grace knew she had to be careful, but she was not going to stop. She wanted the truth. So she stayed quiet, watched closely, and waited. And every day, just like before, Ethan kept pointing at the painting. One morning, while Richard was away on a business trip, the mansion felt quieter than usual. The usual tension in the air seemed slightly lighter without him there. Grace was in the hallway, dusting the furniture near the main staircase, when Ethan suddenly appeared at her side. He didn't say anything at first, but he pulled gently at her sleeve and looked at her with a serious expression. Then, without speaking, he walked to the painting with the golden frame and pointed to it. Grace followed, already feeling that something unusual was about to happen. Ethan raised both hands and motioned like he was trying to remove the painting. He looked back at her, clearly asking for help. Grace hesitated. She knew Richard would be furious if he found out, but Ethan's eyes were pleading. After a moment of silence, Grace made her decision. She carefully lifted the painting off the wall. It was heavier than she expected. As soon as it was removed, they both stepped back. Behind it, hidden in the wall, was a dark hole. The hole was covered in dust and cobwebs, and it looked like no one had touched it in years. Grace leaned closer and could see that the space inside wasn't very deep, but there were several objects tucked away. She reached in slowly and began pulling them out, one by one. There were old papers, a few small boxes, and several photographs wrapped in a cloth. The papers were yellowed with age, but some looked newer. Ethan stood silently beside her, watching everything she did. When she unfolded one of the papers, he suddenly smiled. It was a real smile, warm, small, but very clear. He pointed at the paper and whispered, "Mom." Grace looked down and read what was written. It was a short note, signed by Laura. Grace stared at the signature. It was recent, dated only a year ago. The note also mentioned a pharmaceutical company and included a strange set of initials. Grace felt her heart beating faster. It didn't make sense. Laura was supposed to be dead, but this paper said otherwise. Grace sat on the floor with the documents spread out in front of her. She carefully read each one, trying to make sense of the information. Some were letters, others looked like medical reports or corporate memos. A few mentioned experiments and listed employee names. One photo showed Laura standing near what looked like a company building, and the sign in the background had the same name as the pharmaceutical company mentioned in the letter. Grace couldn't believe what she was seeing. Everything pointed to Laura being alive and somehow connected to this company. The documents seemed to have been hidden for a reason. Maybe Laura had tried to send a message. Maybe someone wanted to keep it secret. Grace didn't know what to think, but Ethan's reaction told her this wasn't a mistake. The boy wasn't confused. He knew what he was showing her. Grace decided to put the items in a small box and hide them in her room for now. She knew Richard would be home soon, and she needed time to think. When Richard returned from his trip later that evening, Grace waited until dinner was over to approach him. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say, trying to find a way to present the discovery carefully. When the time felt right, she followed him into his office and told him that she had found something important behind the painting. At first, he didn't react. But when she pulled out the letter with Laura's signature and placed it on his desk, everything changed. His face turned cold and angry. He stood up suddenly and accused her of invading private property. He said she had no right to go through things that didn't belong to her. Grace tried to explain that Ethan had shown her the hole and that she was only trying to help, but Richard didn't want to hear it. He told her to leave the matter alone and never mention it again. Then he stormed out of the room, leaving Grace standing there, feeling both shocked and scared. She now understood just how serious this discovery was. After that night, the atmosphere in the mansion grew more intense. Richard avoided Grace, barely speaking to her, except to give orders. The rest of the staff seemed more nervous too, though they didn't say why. Ethan, once calmer in Grace's presence, began showing signs of fear again. He started having nightmares almost every night. Grace could hear him crying through the walls, and sometimes he would knock on her door in the middle of the night, just to sit beside her quietly. He didn't speak about the painting again, but he often held one of the old papers tightly in his hand, as if it gave him comfort. Grace didn't press him for answers. She knew he was scared, and so was she. Still, she kept the box of documents hidden in her room, reading them slowly, trying to connect the pieces. She felt like she had uncovered something big, but she didn't yet understand what it meant. She only knew that Laura had not disappeared by accident. And now, someone was trying very hard to keep that secret buried. Despite the fear and confusion, Grace couldn't let go of the truth she had found. She continued to watch everything closely. Richard kept acting like nothing had happened, but there was a tension in his eyes now, like he was constantly on guard. Grace stayed quiet, but she paid attention to every word he said and every room he entered. She checked to make sure the documents were still safe and began writing down everything she observed. She didn't trust anyone anymore. She had thought about leaving the mansion, but she couldn't walk away, knowing that Ethan was still there, scared and trying to tell the truth in the only way he could. So she stayed. She worked during the day, stayed alert at night, and never stopped trying to understand the mystery of Laura's disappearance. The hole in the wall had changed everything. And now, even if no one else wanted to face it, Grace knew she couldn't turn back. The truth was still there, hidden behind the silence, and Ethan's nightmares were proof of that. Richard gave a strict order the next morning. He told the workers to seal the hole behind the painting and make the wall look exactly like before. He didn't want to discuss it. Grace tried to talk to him again, asking why it had to be hidden, but he interrupted her with a cold voice. He told her she was forbidden from speaking to Ethan about what they had found. He said it would only confuse the boy and cause more problems. Grace insisted that Ethan had led her to the hole himself, but Richard didn't listen. He repeated his command and walked away, leaving no room for discussion. Workers arrived that same afternoon and quickly repaired the wall. Within hours, it was as if the hole had never been there. The painting was put back in place. Grace stood nearby, watching with a mix of anger and frustration. She couldn't believe that after everything, Richard was still trying to hide the truth. Ethan saw the wall too, and looked at her with confusion and sadness. After the wall was sealed, things in the mansion changed quickly. The other workers, who used to speak with Grace casually, began to avoid her. When she entered a room, conversations stopped. People looked away or left silently. No one confronted her directly, but she could feel the tension growing. It was clear that someone had spread the story that she had made everything up. Rumors moved fast in the house, and Grace had no way to defend herself. She wanted to explain the truth to someone, but she didn't know who she could trust. Meanwhile, Ethan had changed again. He stopped smiling, stopped playing, and barely left his room. He refused to eat during meals and avoided eye contact with everyone, including Grace. When she tried to talk to him, he just looked down and stayed quiet. The connection they had built was gone. Grace felt helpless. The wall was closed, and so was Ethan. The house felt heavier than before, not just sad, but completely closed off and cold. Even though Richard tried to act like everything was normal, Grace could see that something was bothering him. He spent more time alone in his office and avoided speaking to her unless necessary. She noticed that he had the documents taken from her room, probably by searching when she wasn't around. But Grace had been careful. The night before they were taken, she had made copies of all the important letters, photos, and notes. She kept the copies hidden in a folder at the bottom of her suitcase. She didn't know how long she would be able to stay at the mansion, but she wasn't going to let the evidence disappear completely. She reread the papers often, trying to make sense of them. Some of the names repeated in several documents. There were references to a pharmaceutical company and vague mentions of medical trials. She didn't understand all the terms, but the tone of the letters felt urgent, like Laura had been in trouble or trying to reveal something important. Late one night, while everyone in the house was asleep, Grace quietly made a phone call from her room. She used her old cell phone, one that she rarely turned on. The number she dialed belonged to an old friend, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. His name was Daniel, and he worked as a police officer. When he picked up, she spoke softly and explained that she needed help. She told him she had found letters and documents related to someone who was believed to be dead, but might still be alive. She gave him a few of the names mentioned in the letters and asked if he could investigate discreetly. Daniel didn't ask too many questions, but he agreed to help. He promised to check what he could without making it official. Grace thanked him and ended the call. She sat in the dark for a while afterward, thinking about what she had just done. It was risky, but it was the only step she could take. She knew she couldn't solve this alone. Meanwhile, strange things began happening with Richard. He started getting phone calls at odd hours, sometimes very late at night. Grace noticed how he would step out of the room quickly when the phone rang. When he returned, he always looked nervous or angry. He snapped at the staff more often and spent long periods locked in his office. Grace didn't know who was calling him or what they were talking about, but something was clearly wrong. He had changed. He was still trying to act like he was in control, but his hands trembled sometimes and he barely looked anyone in the eye. Grace began to wonder if the information in the letters was not just a family secret, but something dangerous. The more Richard tried to bury it, the more it seemed to haunt him. She continued to take notes, writing down everything she saw and heard, trying to piece it all together. Ethan continued to stay silent. Grace hoped Daniel would find something soon, something that could explain why Richard was so afraid. The atmosphere in the house continued to grow worse. What used to feel like sadness now felt like fear. The staff avoided any conversation beyond work. No one mentioned the painting, the wall, or what had happened. The mansion itself seemed to close in on them all. Grace could feel the pressure of secrets in every hallway. Ethan rarely left his room, and when he did, he looked tired and disconnected. He had gone back to drawing again, but his drawings were darker now, filled with strange shapes and empty spaces. Grace felt isolated, but she didn't give up. She still watched, still waited, and still hoped for answers. Every night, she checked that the copies were safe. Every morning, she waited for a message or call from Daniel. The house was no longer just a place of grief. It had become a place where something was being hidden, a place where truth was dangerous and silence was expected. But Grace had already stepped too far into the truth to stop. She was determined to uncover what really happened. Grace finally got the response she had been waiting for. Her contact in the police, Daniel, called her early in the morning, speaking in a quiet and serious tone. He said he had looked into the names mentioned in the letters and documents Grace had found. What he discovered was alarming. Most of the people listed were linked to a large pharmaceutical corporation that had been under investigation for years. The company was suspected of hiding illegal medical trials, blackmailing former employees, and erasing information that could expose them. One name stood out among the files: Laura Collins. According to internal documents, Laura had worked closely with the company, but at some point she tried to report them. She was labeled as a whistleblower, someone who had access to damaging information. Then, suddenly, she vanished. The report described her disappearance as suspicious. Grace listened carefully, writing everything down. When the call ended, she sat still for a moment. Now she knew for sure. Laura didn't simply die. Something terrible had been covered up. Later that day, Grace gathered all the copies she had kept hidden. She printed the email Daniel had sent and placed it next to the photos, letters, and notes. She decided it was time to confront Richard again. She walked to his office, knocked on the door, and stepped inside when he called her in. Richard looked tired and distracted. Grace didn't wait for permission. She laid the papers on his desk and explained everything she had learned. Richard listened quietly at first, but when he heard Laura's name connected to criminal activity, he interrupted her. He stood up, shaking his head, saying that it was impossible. He insisted that Laura had died in front of him, that there had been no mistake. Grace stayed calm and showed him the recent photo of Laura, the one dated 2 years after her supposed death. Richard stared at it. His hands trembled. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he slowly sat back down, staring at the photo as if he didn't know what to believe anymore. Richard didn't say anything for a long time. He kept looking at the photo of Laura, then back at the documents, and then at the photo again. Grace stood quietly, watching him process everything. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, less confident, more confused. He said he remembered the day Laura died. He remembered the hospital, the doctors, and the pain of losing her. But now, seeing this photo, he wasn't sure anymore. He asked if it was possible that someone had lied to him. Grace said yes. She told him that Laura might have been taken away or forced into hiding because of what she knew. Richard looked overwhelmed. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. He didn't argue anymore. He didn't accuse her of making things up. Instead, he admitted something that surprised Grace. He said there were parts of that day he had always found strange, but he never questioned them because he didn't want to believe there was more to the story. Now, he wasn't so sure. That night, the house was quiet again, but it didn't feel the same. Grace stayed close to Ethan, who had been withdrawn all day. He didn't speak, barely ate, and seemed lost in thought. Before bedtime, he sat on the floor with his crayons, drawing in silence. Grace sat nearby and didn't interrupt. After several minutes, Ethan brought the drawing to her. It showed a woman surrounded by dark shapes. The woman looked like Laura, and the shapes around her looked like shadows, tall, twisted, and faceless. Ethan pointed to the woman and whispered, "Mom." Then he pointed to the shadows and looked away. Grace felt a chill. It wasn't just a drawing, it was a message. Ethan was showing what he felt, what he remembered, or maybe even what he saw. Grace held the drawing and hugged Ethan gently. He didn't say anything else. That night, she stayed awake longer than usual, thinking about what the picture meant. She knew now that the truth was not just hidden, it was dangerous, and it was still out there. As she lay in bed, Grace thought about everything that had happened. Each discovery led to more questions. The sealed wall, the secret documents, Laura's photo, and now Ethan's drawing. All of it pointed to a larger story. This wasn't just about a missing person or a family tragedy. It was a deeper conspiracy that had been covered up by money and power. Someone wanted Laura gone. Someone had worked hard to erase her from the world, and now that Grace had uncovered part of the truth, she didn't feel safe. She looked over at the folder with the evidence, thinking about what to do next. She knew she couldn't keep it hidden forever. But she also knew she couldn't trust the people around her. She would need help, real help. Maybe Daniel could do more. Maybe the police could reopen the case. Or maybe the danger would grow even more if they tried. Either way, she couldn't go back. She had already stepped too far into a secret that the Collins family had tried to bury. The mansion no longer felt like just a sad and quiet house. It now felt like a place where something dark had happened, and might still be happening. Grace could see the truth in Richard's eyes, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. She could feel it in Ethan's silence, in the drawings he made, and in the way he held onto his memories of his mother. The wealth and power of the Collins family had hidden something terrible, and now that secret was starting to surface. Grace didn't know exactly what would happen next, but she knew the situation was serious. She knew she had to keep going, not just for herself, but for Ethan and maybe even for Laura. There was still more to discover, more to understand. And even though the walls of the mansion looked the same on the outside, Grace knew that inside them were pieces of a truth that had been ignored for too long. She had seen enough to know this wasn't over. It was only beginning. Richard finally reached his limit with the silence, confusion, and strange truths that had been surfacing. After looking again and again at the photo of Laura and reading the copied documents Grace had shown him, he decided to take action. He didn't know who to trust, and he couldn't go to the police without risking exposure, so he hired a group of private investigators. These were professionals who worked quietly and fast. Richard gave them the names from the documents and told them to search for anything connected to Laura, especially any sign that she might still be alive. The investigators got to work immediately. Grace stayed in contact with them on Richard's behalf, helping provide information. She also kept Ethan close during this time, trying to make sure he stayed calm. Even though he didn't fully understand what was going on, he could feel the tension in the house. Everyone was waiting for answers. Days passed slowly, each one full of uncertainty, until one afternoon, the investigators finally called with something concrete. The call confirmed what Grace and Richard had feared and hoped. Laura was alive. She had been living under a different name in a small rural town far from the city. According to the investigators, she was staying in a rented house at the edge of the town, living quietly and keeping to herself. Her identity had been changed, and there was no record of her as Laura Collins in any public system. Grace and Richard didn't wait. They made travel arrangements that same day and took Ethan with them. The trip was tense. Richard didn't speak much, and Ethan looked nervous but curious. Grace stayed calm, focused on supporting both of them. When they arrived, the investigators led them to a modest house with cracked paint and an overgrown yard. It didn't look like a place where someone from a wealthy background would live. Richard looked at the front door for a long time before finally knocking. They waited. A moment later, the door opened slowly, and Laura stood there, thinner, older but clearly her. Laura stared at Richard, then at Ethan. Her eyes filled with tears the moment she saw her son. She stepped outside, dropped to her knees, and opened her arms. Ethan didn't move at first. He looked confused and scared, but then slowly he stepped forward. When Laura hugged him, he finally relaxed and buried his face in her shoulder. Richard stood frozen, watching the scene, not knowing how to react. Grace stepped back, giving them space. Laura cried silently, holding Ethan tightly. After a long moment, she stood and invited them inside. The house was simple, almost bare. There were only the basics: a table, 2 chairs, a small couch, and a mattress on the floor. Laura looked weak and tired, but her eyes were clear. She explained everything. She told them how, years ago, she had discovered that the pharmaceutical company was using Richard's name and signature to cover up illegal experiments. When she tried to expose the truth, she was threatened. Afraid for Ethan's life, she staged her death and went into hiding. As Laura spoke, Richard's face changed. He listened without interrupting, slowly beginning to understand the full story. She had kept silent, suffered alone, and disappeared not out of fear of him, but to protect their son. Laura told him about the letters she tried to send and how she had hidden some in the mansion, hoping someone would find them. She never thought Grace or Ethan would be the ones to uncover the truth. Richard sat down and held his head in his hands. He had believed for years that Laura had died because of a medical emergency. He had trusted the people involved. Now he realized that he had been fooled, used as a tool in a much bigger scheme. He had ignored signs, refused to question things, and lived with guilt and anger that had no reason to exist. The pain hit him all at once. Laura reached out and took his hand. They didn't speak, but something passed between them, an understanding that the past had broken them both. The family stayed in the small town for 2 days. They needed time to talk, to reconnect, and to figure out what to do next. Laura was still scared. She said that if the company found out she was alive, they would come after her again. But Grace reminded her that now, with proof and witnesses, they could start fighting back. Richard agreed. He was no longer going to stay quiet. When they returned to the mansion, things had changed. The staff was shocked to see Laura. Rumors spread quickly, and soon people outside the house began to hear the news. Richard contacted legal teams and prepared documents to release to the media if necessary. But things didn't stay calm for long. Within a few days, strange things began happening. Richard received threatening phone calls. One night, someone followed Ethan on the way back from school, though nothing happened. The company had found out. They were reacting quickly and not peacefully. What had started as a search for answers had now become a dangerous situation. Grace stayed alert. She kept copies of every document in a locked safe and made backups on encrypted drives. Richard increased security around the house and stopped taking public meetings. Ethan stayed close to Laura now, never leaving her side. Laura began recovering slowly, helped by having her son and her old life back. But everyone knew that this wasn't over. The company wouldn't just let them expose everything. They had too much to lose. Richard was no longer the same man from before. The confusion and guilt had been replaced with anger and purpose. He blamed himself for not seeing it sooner, and now he wanted to make it right. Grace remained the one holding everything together, organizing files, handling communication with the investigators, and watching over Ethan and Laura. Each day felt heavier, with more tension and less certainty. The truth had come out, but the consequences were just beginning. The Collins family had found each other again, but now they had to fight to stay together. The mansion, once silent and still, now felt like the center of a storm. Reporters tried to contact the family. Lawyers from the pharmaceutical company sent letters demanding silence. Richard refused to back down. He began preparing public statements and sent selected documents to trusted contacts in the press. Grace kept monitoring everything, checking for suspicious activity around the house. One night, Laura told Grace she still had nightmares about the men who had threatened her. Grace promised her that this time they wouldn't win. Ethan was different too. He had started drawing again, but now his pictures showed his mother, his father, and himself together. The shadows were still there in the drawings, but they were smaller now. Grace took that as a sign. The truth had created chaos, but it had also brought healing. And even though the days ahead would be difficult, the family was no longer hiding. They were finally facing the truth, and they would not let fear silence them again. The past was no longer buried, and the future was still being written. With Grace's help and all the evidence she had carefully gathered, the authorities were finally able to open an official investigation into the pharmaceutical company. Richard, Laura, and Grace handed over every document they had: the letters, the copied files, and the photos hidden behind the wall in the mansion. For the first time, the truth had weight and legal backing. Investigators came to the house, collected the original materials, and began the process of verifying everything. Forensics teams examined the papers and matched signatures, dates, and reports. They confirmed that the documents were authentic and directly linked to illegal activity. Several files mention names of top executives and legal representatives who had helped hide the crimes. These people had used Richard's name and position to cover up unethical practices and fraudulent medical trials. Now, with the documents made public, there was no way to deny the truth. What had been hidden in silence for years had become the foundation of a serious legal case. Richard, though shaken, cooperated fully with the investigation. He gave his official statement and testified about what had happened, how he had trusted the wrong people, how he hadn't questioned the documents he signed, and how his name had been used in ways he never approved. He explained how Laura had disappeared and how, for years, he believed she had died during childbirth. His words were honest, emotional, and full of regret. He didn't try to make excuses. He admitted his failure to act and accepted the role he had played, even if unknowingly. Laura, now legally recognized as alive, also gave her testimony. She told the full story of how she had discovered the fraud, the threats she received, and how she had faked her death to protect Ethan. She spoke calmly, but her words were powerful. Everyone in the courtroom listened closely as she described years of fear, hiding, and silence. Her story shocked the public, especially when connected with the company's long list of previous complaints that had never been taken seriously. While the legal process moved forward, Ethan stayed close to his mother. He still didn't speak much in public, but at home, he had started to laugh again and even play outside. With Laura back, his behavior changed day by day. He seemed lighter, more open, and more present. Grace kept an eye on him whenever Laura or Richard had to be away. The bond between the three had grown stronger, built on trust and shared pain. Ethan started drawing new pictures, images of the mansion, trees, and simple family moments like dinner or walking in the garden. The dark shadows that had once filled his drawings slowly disappeared. For the first time in years, he seemed to feel safe. He didn't point at the painting anymore. He didn't stare at the hallway like something was missing. The fear had started to fade. He was healing in his own quiet way, surrounded by people who finally listened, believed him, and kept him close without forcing him to speak before he was ready. Grace became a key figure during the investigation. Her decision to copy the documents, contact Daniel, and continue looking for answers had made everything possible. Without her, the evidence would have been destroyed, and Laura might have stayed hidden forever. When the media began to report on the case, her name appeared alongside Richard and Laura as one of the people who had exposed the truth. News articles described her as brave, determined, and essential to the case. Grace didn't seek attention, but she received public recognition for her actions. She was interviewed by journalists, invited to speak at events, and offered job opportunities outside the mansion. Still, she chose to stay for now. She had become part of the family's recovery, and she wanted to see things through. She kept helping with the legal documents, answered calls, and made sure Ethan had everything he needed. More than that, she had become someone the family trusted completely, not as a housekeeper, but as a friend and protector during the hardest moments of their lives. The investigation continued for several weeks, but in the end, justice was served. The executives and lawyers responsible for the fraud and threats were arrested. Charges were filed for corruption, destruction of evidence, false identities, and criminal threats. Some of the trials would take months to complete, but the main group was taken into custody. The company's stock dropped sharply, and their name was all over the news. Reporters followed the case daily, updating the public on every development. People were shocked that such a respected company had hidden so many crimes for so long. The Collins case became one of the biggest scandals in recent years. It sparked new investigations into other companies and opened conversations about corporate responsibility. Richard's reputation began to recover as more people understood the full story. Laura was praised for her strength and sacrifice, and Grace became a quiet symbol of how one person's courage can change everything. The story, once hidden behind silence and fear, had now become a symbol of truth and accountability. Back at the mansion, things finally started to change. The house that had once been dark and heavy was now filled with warmth and movement. Sunlight entered rooms that had stayed closed for years. Ethan laughed out loud for the first time in a long while, running through the halls and playing in the backyard. Richard and Laura, still trying to rebuild their relationship, spent more time together. There were still difficult conversations, but they faced them honestly. Grace helped plan meals, arranged small gatherings, and kept the house organized. The staff, once distant and quiet, returned to their regular duties with a new energy. The mansion became more than just a place of memories. It became a place of recovery and hope. Music played again. Laughter echoed through the rooms. People smiled more. Richard looked at his family and knew that despite everything, they had survived. And now, for the first time in years, the Collins family was whole. The house, once filled with silence and secrets, was finally full of life again. Months had passed since everything changed. The mansion, once full of sadness and heavy silence, had gone through a complete transformation. The damaged parts were repaired, old furniture was replaced or restored, and the dark hallways were now lit and warm. The walls were repainted, some rooms were reopened, and new life filled each corner. In the main hallway, the large golden frame no longer held the painting that once hid a secret. Instead, it now displayed a recent photo of the family, Richard, Laura, Ethan, and Grace, standing together in the garden, smiling. It was a simple picture, but it meant everything. It represented a new beginning. Visitors who came to the house noticed the difference right away. It didn't feel cold or distant anymore. The changes weren't just physical. The air was lighter, the space more open, and the fear that once surrounded every room was gone. The mansion wasn't just a house again. It was a home. A real home, rebuilt from truth, healing, and the strength to face everything. Grace was still working at the mansion, but her role had changed. She wasn't just the housekeeper anymore. She was family. Laura often introduced her to guests as someone who had saved them all, and Richard treated her with the respect and warmth of a close friend. She still cleaned, helped with daily tasks, and kept the house in order. But there was something different in the way people spoke to her. She had earned trust and admiration from everyone. Ethan especially stayed close to her. He often followed her around the house, helping with small chores, asking questions, and showing her his drawings. He was no longer the quiet, distant boy who sat alone in front of the painting. He laughed freely now, made jokes, and asked about the world. Grace enjoyed these moments the most. She had seen the worst days in this place, but now she was part of its best ones. Every morning felt like a reward for the battles they had fought together. and survived. Richard had changed too. He spent less time buried in business meetings and more time with his family. He helped Ethan with school, took him for walks, and read stories to him at night. Sometimes they would cook together, making a mess in the kitchen, laughing as they tried to follow recipes. Richard no longer avoided looking at old photos. He had started placing framed pictures around the house, photos of Laura, Ethan as a baby, and even some from the time Grace had started working there. He didn't hide from the past anymore. He faced it, learned from it, and used it to become a better father and husband. There were still moments of sadness, memories that hurt, but they no longer controlled him. He was present, focused, grateful. Laura noticed the change too, and together they worked on building a new life. Not a perfect one, but a real one. One where nothing was hidden and everything could be talked about openly, no matter how painful. Laura, after many months of rest and adjustment, decided to return to her professional life. But this time she chose a different path. Instead of going back into the medical or corporate world, she focused on social projects. She partnered with small organizations that helped women in crisis, especially those who needed to escape dangerous situations like she had. She used her experience to help others speak up, fight back, and stay safe. Her story, though painful, had given her a voice that others wanted to hear. She gave talks, wrote articles, and volunteered her time. At home, she was also fully present with Ethan. They painted together, played board games, and sometimes just sat in the garden watching the birds. Laura looked healthier. She smiled more. She didn't flinch at sudden sounds or avoid certain conversations anymore. Her healing was ongoing, but she was no longer hiding. She had taken her life back, and now she was using it to protect and guide others, starting with her own son and family. Ethan was perhaps the one who changed the most. The quiet, withdrawn child who used to point at shadows and draw dark shapes had become a joyful, expressive boy. He talked clearly now, asked questions about everything, and made friends with other children in the area. His teachers noticed how curious and intelligent he was. He no longer had nightmares. He slept through the night peacefully, always with his favorite stuffed animal and a drawing pad nearby. His pictures were now colorful, scenes of parks, family dinners, and animals. He loved drawing birds and flowers, and he often showed them to Grace with pride. Laura would hang some of them on the fridge. Richard kept one on his desk. Ethan no longer looked lost. He had found his place in the world again. The fear that once shaped his life had faded, replaced by laughter, learning, and love. For the first time in his life, he had stability. A father who was present, a mother who was safe, and a home that no longer felt broken. That evening, after another calm and happy day, Grace stood by the large window in the living room. She had just finished wiping down the last glass panel. The sky outside was orange and soft as the sun began to set. Music played gently from a radio in the kitchen, and she could hear Laura and Richard talking as Ethan laughed in the background. Grace looked around the room and smiled. There was no more fear here, no secrets hiding in the walls. The past had been painful, but it had brought them to this moment. She folded the cloth she had used, placed it in the basket, and took one last look at the family photo in the golden frame. It no longer held a secret or a shadow, just a memory of what they had overcome together. Grace felt calm. For the first time since she stepped into the mansion, everything was as it should be. She turned off the lights and walked away from the window, knowing that this was peace, and they had earned it. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought, and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.